We will now hear from Miranda Kerrigan, the opposition, please.
Friends, lovely speech. Unfortunately, I'm utterly unsure how lottery-selected politicians are able to use legislation or create legislation that is going to be better than the status quo when there is absolutely no mechanism of accountability in a lottery system. So, 3 points. First, the inherent problems that come with implementing a lottery-based system, and that will fundamentally destabilize democratic government. Second, party politics actually might be a good thing for our government and democracies, even with some of the inherent flaws that come with it. Third, what are some of the challenges that democracies now face, and why did they become worse in a lottery system? So first, there are some inherent problems that come with implementing a lottery-based system, and that fundamentally destabilize government. How so? So one of the core values of liberal democracies is the right to choose. Citizens allow themselves to be governed because they have the ability to participate in a democratic process of government. What does this look like? This looks like voting. This looks like for running for office. This looks like joining political parties. This looks like even campaigning. This looks like meeting with your mayor or your elected official. But like all forms of government, there are still at times issues of corruption and elitism. And politicians are an absolute fucking nightmare. No one is denying that. However, we think that a lottery system does not fix corruption when the only mechanism of accountability that citizens have is gone, which is voting. For example, imagine a scenario in which the lottery system is in place, in which a legislator of a district turns out to be corrupt. Note, there's no mechanism in a lottery system that prevents corrupt citizens from being elected. So the corrupt legislator finishes his term, probably not providing that much assistance to his constituents. Now we have another legislator, also picked by a lottery system. There is absolutely no mechanism in place to make sure that this legislator is also corrupt or not. It's all up to chance. We think that's inherently problematic. So even if there's a mechanism in place to prevent like blatant illegal corruption, there's still no way for citizens to have their opinion on policy heard. When a politician or a party is not meeting the needs of people, they can be voted out. It's really simple, and it's a very clear sign that a party has to change in order to survive. Speaking of parties, this is my second point. Party politics is actually beneficial for an efficient government. So a lot of different ideologies. Elections allow parties to develop and adapt different ideologies. A lottery system removes any incentive for a one-term politician to enact party ideology. And even if you believe that party politics is damaging and should not be followed, a lottery selection also means, in essence, that the mass appointment of one-term politicians without any political experience and without the fundamental necessary guidance of a party. This would be, point blank, the most chaotic democratic government ever enacted. A successful democracy needs to be effective and legitimate in the eyes of the people. It is specifically elections that allow those who would be good policymakers to make their case for public good to the public. Good governance usually requires specific knowledge taxation rates, healthcare, education, etc. The list goes on. These are an essential part of what a legislator's duty is. Parties allow policy to be discussed, to be critiqued, and to be revised, and create the necessary hierarchical structures to make sure those in power know what policies the party wants to go.
If I'm an African American in Alabama, how am I ever going to hold someone accountable?
Okay. Yeah. So I get that, like, a main point of yours is that, like, fundamentally party politics is only allowed for the elite, so-called. But I think the core problem is, one, we know that actually politics has been able to adapt and change, that the elitism that you so-called say is so apparent in our current democratic systems can actually be changed and challenged. Second, even if this does allow more diversity, if the diversity that happens doesn't lead to successful governance, to a legitimate and effective government, I'm not sure it's practically a good idea. I have no idea why a diverse government would lead to good politics. Finally, what challenges are democracies facing right now, and why do these become worse in a lottery system? Western democracies have a number of ills, but most prominently is a distrust of government that comes from a fundamental belief that the government has ultimately failed to meet the needs of the people. These are a relatively new critique of democracy and have only really appeared in the last 40 years or so. It's clear that electoral democracy is not fundamentally the cause of these problems. External social or economic factors are. So, as I have explained, there's no certainty that the citizens elected by lottery will have the necessary experience or capacity to successfully legislate. There will no longer be effective policies to guide them, and therefore it will be more likely that the government will fail to meet the needs of the people, furthering distrust between government and people, distrust that is heightened when the main mechanism of accountability, voting, is gone. Fundamentally, lottery system is flawed.
We now move on to our next speaker for the proposition, Jack Kennedy.
Thank you for the floor. The Bolsheviks were wrong to dissolve the Russian Constituent Assembly in 1918, yes. But their ideological after-the-fact justification was correct in places. Parliamentary democracy was broken 101 years ago, and it is broken now. I'm going to talk about a couple of things in this speech. First of all, I want to talk to you about some assumptions. I think we've been led to assume that this is that the parliamentary democracy, when I say this, that's what I mean, the parliamentary democracy is the only way to achieve proper democracy, that it's the only way to properly achieve representation of the people in terms of how they're governed. I think that is, on the face of it, not particularly true. I think there are lots of ways in which this is done differently in other facets of the world, but also in other countries. Like in the Dutch system, you don't get to vote for a politician, you vote for an ideology, and then the parties pick a specific person, a specific list of people in order to fill the legislature after that. We allow juries to be picked by this method who arguably have a much bigger impact on individual people's lives than the average piece of legislation does. We use random sampling to get an idea of how people are going to vote in parliamentary elections ahead of time. The only reason that we have parliamentary democracy under the status quo, and the only reason we continue to think that it is the best way to achieve this, is because of tradition. It's because it's been done that way. It's because when the first democracies, places like the United States of America, places like Britain, when it became untenable for it to be an absolute monarchy continuously, happened to opt for this model. There's no reason particularly to believe that it's the only way to do it. And also, it's because it feels nice, right? Because it feels nice to go and put a little piece of paper in the box on election day, and you feel like you're participating, but there are lots of reasons to believe that you're not. At the end of the day, the goal of a democracy is to represent the will of the people, and there are lots of different ways to do that. But I would also note that specifically when the Founding Fathers were establishing the American Constitution, they specifically picked a representative democracy in order to insulate the government from the will of the people. They figured that if a direct democracy was something that was implemented in the United States, that they would be swayed by the changing wills of the people. They specifically wanted there to be less representation. They also didn't give the vote to 80% of the population, but that's perhaps beside the point. We think specifically agree that parliamentary democracy in many ways was designed to insulate people from their mode of government. What we hear from the opposition is that that's a good thing, that things like expertise and stability are wonderful things, that we get them more under this form. I'm going to talk about a couple of reasons why that's not true and why there exist other problems with parliamentary democracy. First, just look at the evidence of it. What expertise does Boris Johnson bring to the table? To what degree did Leo Varadkar's medical degree make him qualified to do Brexit negotiations? I'm just not sure in what universe any of this is true. Most of the politicians in Ireland are school teachers by training, and while school teachers are wonderful, I don't know why they're the best qualified people to run a country where they're more qualified than anyone else. So just on the face of it, that's not true. They ask us about accountability. Let's talk a little bit about accountability. Again, it does not exist under the status quo. There exist massive advantages to incumbents in elections. What are these? First of all, on the worst end of it, people redraw electoral boundaries in the US, one of the most historical democracies in the world, in order to benefit themselves. But also specifically, when you're a politician, you can use your platform to speak and get a benefit that your opponent who's not in government can't do. You can use your connections with lobbyists and that kind of thing to fund your campaign. But it costs a lot of money to run a campaign to be a politician. That's something that's fundamentally not accessible to a large number of people. Gabby tells you about this. She tells you about why there are structural reasons why 20% of TDs in the Dáil are landlords and why the same percentage is true for MPs. That's not a coincidence. It's because the system is designed in such a way that it is much easier and much more possible to become a representative if you're rich. The response we get from the Oxford team is that why is diversity an inherent good? I would say two things. First of all, there are structural reasons why a small group of people with a very specific background are not going to be able to legislate for the average person. Landlords are not going to be very good at making tenants' rights. In fact, historically, they do quite the opposite. But I would also just say that it's just wrong. It is wrong that a small, ludicrously privileged section of the population gets to decide how the country is run. And that's what this current system produces, and that's not something that we can stand by. But also, even leaving aside all the structural reasons that parliamentary democracy falls the way that it does, I think just ask the average person. Ask the average person on the street in Dublin or New York or London what they think of politicians as a class, and they will all tell you the same thing, that they don't trust them, that they're not like you and me, and they don't do the things that we want them to do. So their current system is not working. Also note that, look, I just think the majority of politicians are cowards. If you want to talk about accountability mechanisms, it is not clear necessarily that the desire to be re-elected means that you do the things that the people most want. I think it means that you do the things that tack towards the status quo the most. I think that's why it took politicians in Ireland so long to come around on the repeal movement. I think that's why the US politicians keep gerrymandering, because that is the thing that benefits them most in terms of getting re-elected. What gets you re-elected and what the people want are not the same thing. Not that the worst thing that can be done to you is an accountability mechanism in parliamentary democracies that you don't get re-elected. That is something that under a lottery system is guaranteed to happen to you. Yes, there is no accountability mechanism or whatever, but the worst thing they can do is have one term worth of legislation and then they're gone and the next people can undo that. But also note there don't exist ways in which they can abuse that. If you're not going to be a career politician, you make lobbyist connections and continue to take money from the tobacco industry and push down legislation that will regulate their industry because it will allow you to stay in office, because there's no way for you to stay in office. We solve all of those problems. Let's talk about what the alternative might look like. I think ultimately concerns over stability and expertise are, as I said, non-comparative, that there is no guarantee. Israel is about to slide into its third election in a year. Belgium went 2 years without a government. The Northern Irish Assembly has been out of whack for 2.5 years. Stability is not something that exists under parliamentary democracy. But also in terms of stability and expertise, I'm just not sure why those things are inherent goods or why they're more important than the idea of representation. If it is true that parliamentary democracy cannot accurately represent the views of the people, and because of all the analysis Gabby gives you, I think she pretty well proves that it's not the views of the people it represents, the views of a select number of people that it represents. I'm not sure why stability and expertise, even if they were things that were achieved in parliamentary democracy, are more important than these things. Democracy fundamentally asserts that the legitimacy of a government comes when the government's policies and when the government's conduct as a government line up with the will of the people. That is not well achieved by parliamentary democracy, and ultimately that is a more important concern than concerns of stability and expertise. I think also that concerns of expertise are often used to suppress specific kinds of politics. I think that a lot of economics professors would tell you that Jeremy Corbyn's plan to nationalise all the trains and give us free broadband are not economically tenable, but they're also ludicrously popular and they poll very well with people on the street. And I think that if we got more of different voices in government, we would get things that would line up the average number of people more. I also think at the end of the day, more people are going to have faith in democracy if that's something they want to talk about. When there are people who look like me in government, when there is my friend down the street got to be a legislator for a year, when there's a chance I will eventually get to do that. Yes, getting to put a piece of paper in a box is nice, but when the same people keep getting elected year on year out, and when Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are still the same two parties who dominate Irish politics after 70 years, that is something that is fundamentally broken, and it's something we can't abide anymore. We're proud to propose.
We will now hear from the next opposition speaker, and that's Mr. William Preston.
Whoops, sorry.
It's very easy when you get a series of unpopular leaders in a row to say, let's throw out the entire system and get something better. Yes, I was expecting a pot shot at Boris. Yes, it's cheap. That's an old joke. But the more important thing in this debate is to weigh up what actually produces a better system. Democracy is the only way that you give governments a sense of legitimacy, develop a sense of policy development, and develop a properly accountable system. That's why we are standing in its defense. So I'm going to be dealing with those three themes in this speech. First, and yes, you were correct, I am going to talk about legitimacy and fairness and why that's so important to a political system. Remember, this debate doesn't happen in some kind of vacuum. We have a culture in which people are very used to the idea that if they want to implement a policy, that they will be able to vote for that particular policy. What we hear from the government, or the permanent, or whatever you call it in this format, team, is that it's like, well, minorities aren't represented. If you have lotteries, you'll have more minorities represented, and this will solve the problem. Two responses to that. First, we've actually already across Western democracies seen a great increase in representation from minority groups. This is not to say the system is perfect, but the system is growing. We've had a black president in the United States. We've also got the first ethnic minority chancellor in the United Kingdom. We think progress is being made in that direction. But secondly, if we accept that there are going to be minorities under, they're going to be a minority under a lottery system, they're going to be a minority under a parliamentary system, you're actually going to be less likely to, you're actually, if you're just selected by lottery from a random minority district, you're still going to be like one voice in 100. You're going to be far more likely to have influence if you're part of a much wider cross-parliamentary party and actually have influence in that system than represent an election. No, thank you. But we think there's a couple of reasons why democracy and democracy and the idea of voting for things is such a fundamentally important concept, going back to my own substantive material from Roman. Because we think generally people are used to their ideas prevailing, and people are more likely to accept a debate if they, or more likely to concede defeat on a certain issue if they feel that their side has lost. And we think that the odds of the sortition system producing a legislature that directly corresponds with the will of the people all the time aren't necessarily especially high, particularly given that we accept most elections are decided on a 55-45 basis. The odds, therefore, of a parliament being swung the other way are quite high. This is particularly damaging in two situations. First, when you have very sensitive issues of social change. For example, things like same-sex marriage or abortion. Now, in those particular instances, you have a large, 40% of the population that may have their opinions informed by a religious or a social context, which means they're not necessarily going to be interested in the cut and sort of throw of debate in those things. The only way, therefore, you can actually get people to accept the outcome is if you have some kind of democratic mandate, whether it be through an election where someone campaigns on that manifesto, or you have a direct referendum in and of itself. No, thank you. Which means that even if one side then is more likely to never accept this particular thing, they'll at least say, well, okay, the majority of people accept same-sex marriage. There is nothing I can do to oppose it. Therefore, I will accept it. So, we've seen this happen with the same-sex marriage in Ireland. We've seen it happen with Australia as well. Secondly, we have times of crisis. Often, particularly in times of economic distress, there is a perceived need to rechange the policy debate very quickly in terms of work out we should punish the particular ideology that governs, or and replace it with another ideology. Remembering that even in a world in which there is a parliament where there is no defined parliamentary factions, ideology and ideological divides are still going to exist. There are still going to be people who believe in big government, still people who are going to believe in smaller government. We think it's very important that people are able to feel that if an ideology has failed, that ideology is able to be kicked out. If people do not feel their chances, that their opinions are able to be communicated in this way, we think that is something that is going to be far more likely to drive people towards a sort of radicalism and extremism, and you're actually going to see Boris Johnson and Donald Trump on steroids rather than any sort of improvement. Yeah, I'll quickly take a POI if anyone has one.
Yeah, notions of acceptance are all very well, but fear of that 40% of the population who are deeply conservative meant that same-sex marriage came around in Ireland much slower than it would have otherwise, long after the majority of people had come in favour of that. Why are my human rights less important than the notion of people believing in the government?
Well, I mean, they're also my human rights as well. But look, I think the thing is, like, one, there's actually no guarantee that same-sex marriage would have come any sooner, right? Because it's just as probable, like it's almost 50-50 that you would have had a legislature that would have sort of decided against it. And ultimately, what you really want with this to solve these policy debates is a way that, like, you know, make sure the issue is solved once and for all. Like, the right's not going to try and then get a majority and then try to reverse that position. Once it's been implemented and it has the support and it's perceived to have like some kind of democratic mandate imposed on it, it's going to be far more difficult to reverse change once it's already been implemented. So then, secondly, and because I'm like terrible at time management, let's then look at policy implementation. And again, like, why you're more likely to get more representative policies on this side than on the other side. And again, we have this idea that, you know, we have this analogy drawn with jury systems, that you can have, people can be selected to decide things like jury service, therefore they're perfectly entitled to decide matters of policy, therefore they're going to be more likely to be exempted from, we also have more stuff about like people being influenced by you know, vested interests and the rest of it. We think this is far less likely to happen in a world. This is going to be, if anything, like less likely to happen in a world with democracy versus a democracy. Why? A couple of reasons. Like, one, as my first speaker has already pointed out, like, governing is an extremely complex business. Like, a few days of training to sit in a legislature is not going to teach you like how parliamentary procedure works. There's always going to be some kind of parliamentary procedure on either side of the house. It's not going to teach you like how the bureaucracy works, because you can't just say, I want this to happen. You need to understand exactly how this sort of thing is going to happen. And you know, like, we've actually seen like governments that have less experience in government and that get elected tend to be less successful. Remember, one of the reasons why Trump is such a disaster is because he tries to run government like a corporation. Like, he thinks that he can just hire and fire people and impose his will when he's really dealing with a completely different beast. And we think like you're far more likely to you're far less likely to have people exceed through the parliamentary ranks if they have like a long career in politics where they've had to start off as a councillor or a backbencher, understand how to communicate messages and actually work within existing structures, and you're far more likely to then achieve existing change than you are under the status quo. But also, we think like the other thing is, like, if you're talking about dealing with vested interests and challenging them, who is going to be the person who's more likely to decide, you know, to be able to stand up? Someone who, as Jeremy Corbyn, like, wins an election with a strong mandate and who's then confronted with the Murdoch press or the Bank of England or whoever else says, I'm going to implement this policy anyway, I have a mandate to do it, I have X number of million votes to prove it. Or is it going to be someone who has no experience with the system, which means they don't necessarily have the self-confidence to engage in the sort of debates, and is going to be, even if their own intuition says, like, I would actually, you know, would like the idea of nationalizing the railways, they're going to be far more likely to be, to defer to experts, to technocrats, to people who, like, and we know that technocrats do have their very sort of own ideological agendas. That's why, like, Treasury, like, I don't know, fiscal policy is very so dramatically over the centuries. We think, like, and, you know, similarly, like, if like someone like Mark Zuckerberg's asked them out to dinner, I mean, what sort of flattery is going to persuade you? So we think, like, because you essentially get better policy, better representation, and, you know, generally just a better policies, so proud to propose. Awesome.
We'll now hear from our third speaker of the proposition, Jack Lewis. Just before we begin, Jack, another quick reminder that we will be taking no speeches for this evening's debate. We have one up top. So if you would like to speak against the motion, please write your name on a piece of paper and send it to the front. Thank you.
Ready? Sean, you ready? Cool. Okay, right. So I think when first opposition gets up and stands and goes, this doesn't matter because in democracies at the moment, in Western liberal democracies, you can elect people, but also you can get rid of those politicians, right? That's the logical accountability, that anyone in some form can hold people accountable. The POI that I give to that speaker, though, is if I am a person of color in Alabama, it doesn't matter that I have that vote because that vote never means anything, right? Insofar as it's always going to be two-party ideologies and one always has the majority, I'm unsure how I ever, firstly, hold that person accountable when they're literally passing policies that are racist and discriminatory against me. Secondly, if I'm a woman who cares about my reproductive rights, I'm unsure how I hold that state accountable insofar as that thing is unlikely to ever change because those ideological things are so entrenched. At the point where you get a random sample of people, it is more likely that those people are likely to talk about those things at a very minimum, because under status quo, when those things are tabled, they are removed at the very point that they are brought to that table, right? It is because those things are seen as taboo value and have no interest because of ideology, right? But also an ideology, right? Because the same speaker talks to you about why party systems are maybe inherently good, right? And so far as those party systems may or may not be inherently good, right? And they say, because people have ideologies, right? And so far as the people do have ideologies, and that ideology dictates how they act upon those things. Note that while if tomorrow the Labour Party and the Conservative Party's ideology may still exist in every action that I choose, in 50 years' time, I don't think that ideology will be as dominant. I think when people have to deal with policies, they're more likely to compromise, right? Because if I'm in a broad church party and my entire life and political ideology, everything that I've believed in is around that ideology, irrespective of whether I think it's right or wrong, because I've put so much of my life building up the ranks that are so important to me and getting to that political top, if the only thing that I care about is reaching the top of politics, I'm unsure why I ever actually go off that ideology or I'm willing to compromise, right? Note that that changes when you elect politicians by lottery, right? Because your fear isn't one, that I'll get ostracized from my party for not, voting for Boris's Brexit deal, or secondly, it's just things that firstly, not getting ostracized, or secondly, right, because you can't get voted out, so you're more likely to take those decisions that you believe in rather than what you think are in your own self-interest in the long term, right? Because note that you don't have the same electoral incentives. You're unlikely to be lobbied in the same way. I'm unsure why that is not inherently good or inherently better, right? Because op don't ever actually engage with that. They go, but instability, right? I'm unsure, again, why instability is so bad, but I will get on to that. On corruption, right? I just don't see how corruption is in this debate. I think that if I'm a person who's like a cabinet member and someone manages to pay me money, I think I'm likely to be more powerful than 1 in 500 person who may or may not be corrupt, right? I think it's just like, corruption kind of happens. I don't think it does, right? I just don't see why politicians who are in positions of power on our side are more likely to be corrupt when on their side they have a direct incentive. Go for it, Luke.
So, particularly on that point, do you think that the people that you were elected randomly are immune to being easily led by, say, entrenched civil servants who serve for a long period of time as advisors? And if that is not the case, why is corruption?
Like insofar as, yes, I get advice from a public servant, and that's probably true because, again, there's things on stability falls out of this debate at the point I do that. I'm unsure why when I don't have any political incentive to believe them, and they themselves have to literally convince me that what they're saying is true and is good for me and for the people around me. Insofar as they have to do that, I don't think that's corruptible. I think that's just common sense, convincing someone of an ideology or a policy that is inherently good, insofar as there's still a burden for you to prove that, right? But even if you prove it to that one person, you still have to prove it to a majority, and even if that is corruption, I'm not sure how that one person out of 500 does the types of things that they do, right? Because that is the issue that exists in status quo with strongman leaders in democracies, right? But on what we get out of the second opposition speaker, and this is largely going through this debate, right? Because they go, minorities are being represented better in society, right? And they're like, because we had one person of color president in America and the chancellor from the Conservative Party, that suddenly means that we're diverse and suddenly means that politics is totally fine, right? What our prop isn't that it's minority groups, it is that it's political minorities. That is literally everyone who's not a white man, right? And so far as that is true and that exists in the status quo, I think that like degrees of intersectionality even within those groups still exist. So even if it is Barack Obama, I don't think Barack Obama necessarily has a degree of the same experiences that the average person of color in America has, right? Because he did come from a position of privilege, right? But also, the thing that is bad under status quo about policy is that, look, women are 3 times more likely to table policy on women's issues in Parliament. This is true in America, it is true in Ireland, and it's true in the UK, right? And so far as that's true, and women are still massively underrepresented, and this often applies for other groups, right? And so far as that is true and that happens, I think it just means that you have more discussion around what is good for women and what is good for those minorities within society. We think that means that you're more likely at the point those things are tabled, because men aren't just going to be like this seems really bad, right? I think when issues actually come up and are actually tabled and don't have political incentives about what you need to set the agenda as that is in my long-term electoral goals, I think you're more likely to get discussions around them. You're also more likely to get change around them because people are more likely to support them, right? But also they go that legitimacy is important, right? Because you get a mandate from that referendum, right? Like, look, I get a mandate from that referendum, but I still has to be passed by that parliament, by the same people who are elected. Insofar as that's true, it is not, it's always the people who are representing you that still choose to pass that in the first place, right? Insofar as that is true, I think people are still going to accept the legitimacy of that, right? Of that institution. But simultaneously, I think we accept the rulings of the Supreme Court who aren't elected in the same way in almost every country, right? Because we identify that those people are A, representing our views, or B, are in a position of power in identifying what is good, and if C, if that is so bad, then it's likely to be changed in the future. They don't engage with that. But also, on economic policy, right? Because the thing about stability is largely to do economic policy and how you view instability, that's bad. I think that the potential and the significant probability of passing more legislation that helps women, that helps minorities within society is significantly better than any economic policy that may be passed, right? Because I might be extreme here, but I think dignity and reasonable rights are a prerequisite to any economic policy meaningfully improving my life. Insofar as that I may have economic capital, I think I care more about my rights within that society before I care about the economic capital that I have within that society. Because regardless, I have to live in that society before I get economic capital and after I get economic capital. Thank you.
So we now hear from our third and final opposition speaker. Just a quick announcement, we'll be accepting a proposition floor speech from Sean Gordon Dalton and an opposition floor speech from Stephen Hammond. Thank you.
So right, the way the government sets out this debate today, right, if I were you, I would vote for them too. Because essentially the choice they're trying to make is one in which we live in fairy tales, unicorns, a perfect world where we don't dirty our hands in the practicals, how this thing's going to work out. Whereas opposition somehow has to defend every iteration, every form, every misfunctioning of democracy that exists, but somehow, you know, when they talk about philosophy and sortition, the practicals don't matter, the technicalities don't matter. We think that with this kind of choice, it's no surprise that it seems like they're just not willing to engage. But essentially, right, we're not here to argue the extremely unfashionable view of defending the status quo. What we're saying today is that we think there is something intrinsically important about electoral democracies, that relationship between the elected and the electorate, right? The relationship that allows you to vote people who represent you and to kick them out of office if they don't. They need to show why intrinsically lotteries have a place in public life, why they do things that no form of representative government can, and we think that they've simply not been able to show that today. They've given us an argument based on dubious principles, one that draws tense analogies to jury duties, to like allocations of goods, which I will show you makes no sense at all. Secondly, they've shown us something that's unworkable with no details as to how this will be implemented whatsoever. And we'll simply tell you today, no thank you, that they will lose the benefits of an elected government without gaining any of the hypothetical benefits that they seek to propose today. Firstly, on this issue of their model. Well, in their world, right, a bunch of people will come together, super enthusiastic, will sit together with no preconceptions, will be super qualified based on some briefing that they get, will discuss things in a very open-minded way and come to this magical middle ground solution all of the time. We say, why is that the case? When we look at current systems that exist, right, we see that oftentimes these kinds of consultative bodies come once the debate's already been framed through an electoral system. These people come having part-time jobs with very short briefs. Half of them don't show up to all their meetings. A quarter of them drop out before they finish the whole process. No thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, we say that oftentimes you have things like people not willing to show up, people putting their names on ballots to join these kinds of consultative public, mini publics, which are not representatives of the public at large. So we say that if you actually look at what this looks like in the current models and simply say you're going to scale it up, you have many more practical things to deal with. More importantly, so far, the kind of mini publics we see are consultative bodies. They're not those that have the final definitive public say. And we think when you increase the stakes to this level, and when you increase the kind of political wager that's at stake, we think that you will see a fundamental change in the characters of these mini publics. You'll see a fundamental shift in how they operate. But before I move on, yes?
So national government is an incredibly complex task. If I'm in office for 4 years, do I have the capacity to run an incredibly complex department? What magical thing does any human have that is clearly contingent on technocratic expertise independent
So, firstly, are these people going to be taken out of their current day jobs? Are these people going to be having a full-time job in government? One of the things is that these people politicians dedicate their entire time to deliberating these kinds of things. They exist within parliaments where they are forced to account for their choices. They are structured in a place where they are accountable to select committees, that they have to stand for re-election, so they're sensitive to public pressure. All of this does not exist in this kind of mini-public that they're trying to propose. And they have not given us any details of how they're going to recreate these kinds of structures that do create structures of accountability. More importantly, they come and slip in this sneaky thing, no thank you, about, oh, we'll have this professional staff, this deep state that will teach them what to do. Ladies and gentlemen, we see like civilians who have no experience in public government coming together for maybe 4 years where they have no experience in their professional lives, being told that there are these people who are supposed to help them. We see that really, right, there are many problems before we can even start to see what a society with sortition looks like. And they have not done anything to clarify that. They've simply tried to keep their hands clean, try to not discuss that issue. But more importantly, let's really assess what they have brought up, which is actually very thin and fluffy, in terms of the metrics that they set up. Firstly, this idea of representation. How? Firstly, right, we think that, ladies and gentlemen, there are different forms of representation. One form of representation is demographic representation. Oh, I see someone who looks like me, etc. There's also another form of representation that says there is a national mandate, there is a program, a policy that I stand for, I vote for a party, and I see my interests replicated in parliament. That is one form of representation that they don't get. So why, firstly, do we prioritize demographic representation over all kinds of representation? And secondly, do we really get that? Because we see, firstly, will you be forcing people who don't want to be part of this mini-public to do this kind of jury duty? If not, will they be self-selecting? Will they be actually representative of the people? Will they actually show all kinds of demographics? We think that, ladies and gentlemen, it is simply unsure how they actually create this representation or the kind of representation that necessarily everyone believes in. Secondly, this idea of accountability, right? Because really this issue is one of incentive alignment. What they're trying to say today is that we will avoid corruption, we will avoid these party politics, these interest groups that lobby us, but this cuts both ways. Because if these people are insulated from any kinds of pressures, this includes the pressure to be responsive to public will, this includes the pressures of the elected of winning elections, this includes the fact, no thank you, that they will simply be making whatever choice they deem fit at that point of time. If this committee wants a certain policy, they will implement it. When they get lotteried out of their post, another committee will have their own ideas of what society looks like. They'll have something else. What kind of accountability, what kind of policy formulation, what kind of direction for a country comes from a system like that? So the same way that you do avoid these kinds of political pressures, these political pressures are the exact things that structure national discourse, that structure policy formulation, without which you really go nowhere as a government. And next, this idea of demographic representation. And simply put, right, ladies and gentlemen, they've not really been able to show unique benefits of their model. Because they came up here today and they said that these are good things that can come from lottery systems. Why, however, are these unique to a lottery system? And we think they've not really shown this. If you're talking about demographic representation, we say, why is this intrinsic to having a lottery system? You could have things that introduce larger proportions of minority groups into your parliament, and you may say you'll never reach a kind of equal demographic proportion. We say, why is that necessary? Because the fundamental principle is that representatives are complex people that can represent views that are outside of their own personality. And right, ladies and gentlemen, as long as you do have these voices represented, do have these people at the table, you can achieve rights for minority groups, you can achieve representation without having it directly mapped to the demographics. They've shown a lot of other things, but ultimately, right, what we see is a side government that tries to strawman us. They're trying to say that we have to define and defend parliamentary democracies in the worst form that they currently exist. We say no, they need to defend lotteries, and they have not shown why they uniquely achieve anything that we cannot do so on opposition. We take this debate.
So we have two additional speakers to recognize, starting with the speakers in favor of the motion, to be Sean Gordon Dalton.
Why elect politicians by lottery? Jesus, lads, it's genius. How many people ever win the Euro Millions? The chances are astronomically low. If we elect politicians by lottery, the likelihood of ever getting any is infinitesimally small. Can you imagine how great the world would be without politicians? Now, maybe I've seriously misunderstood the concept of this lottery, but there's much more to my speech, I swear. What proposition does is it totally cockblocks the die-hard political miscreants from achieving their dominating ambitions. Wouldn't that be great? No Bojos, no Trumps. Op said that we would get more demagogues on the proposition. Shall I go on? We have Salvini's, Lukashenko's, Putin's, Orbán's, Duterte's. Excuse me. If the Amazon, finishing on Bolsonaro, is the lungs of the world, Bolsonaro is a daily pack of cigarettes. On the importance of voting, the argument that Op make, equivocating the power with the ability to elect, is a forced and false comparative, as the election of representatives does not translate to a direct and effective participation as citizens. That is not to say that voting is not the most important mechanism in the execution of power, given that the members of our legislatures and executives and courts will be chosen to propose and vote on decrees. But before being put to popular vote, rather sortition as a method of choosing members of the Assembly and Executive diminishes the capacity for apathy, increases the participation of citizenry in the running of the state, and I therefore contend that the direct form of democracy is more in line with our ideals of democracy, those being a true and strong form of citizens' participation in the public realm. The debate about whether this is indeed the best system aside, it is evident that as citizens we could genuinely exercise our voice and will in the running of the state. This will be a truly isocratic society in that any citizen could occupy any official positions of power within the constitutional order. Opposition gave you some great, or spoke very highly of party politics. I would like to point out that every party is run by a demagogue. Not every member of the Labour Party is a die-hard 1970s socialist like Jeremy Corbyn. Not every member of the Tory Party is a die-hard English nationalist like Boris Johnson, but every one of them is far too afraid to speak up for fear of their party whips. In deciding whether the voters themselves are the best and most adequate way of holding executives to account, or indeed the lottery is a more able policer of executive abuses, it comes down to which is the more efficient. Voters suffer several setbacks in their abilities to check executive abuses. As Prop have outlined, the time between elections can allow executives to continue perpetuating harm or implement policies that don't have majority support. In their position of power, they can alter the playing field to favour themselves even further by engaging in practices such as gerrymandering, influencing the media and the judiciary. These problems become void with a system of sortition, an executive and an assembly chosen by lottery, and all legislation put to popular vote. As Jean-Jacques Rousseau said in The Social Contract, the people of England regard themselves as free, but they are grossly mistaken. They are free only during the election of members of Parliament, and as soon as they are elected, slavery overtakes, and it is nothing. As the vast majority of democracies are representative and not direct, elected officials can act out of personal or partisan interests, or even in what they believe to be the best interests of their local constituency over the national electorate. This means the only incentive that representatives have to listen to the wishes of their constituents are their chances of re-election. The founding fathers of the US introduced the Electoral College to prevent demagogues rising to power based on manipulating the popular vote. Look how that turned out. With a lottery system, we totally obliterate the capacity of smooth talkers to take power and reshape politics, society, and the system in their own image. Op asks, what form of accountability do we bring to this? The Greeks had a very good system, ostracization. In your own parliament of Westminster, you have a voter recall petition. In your system, 10% of the voting population can sign a petition to recall that member of parliament, and it goes to a by-election. If members of our executives or legislatures chosen under sortition abuse their powers, we can do the very same. Thank you very much.
Very good. So we now have one last speaker in opposition, and that will be Cameron.